How do we know what we know about turfgrass science? Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. I'm about 1 minute late because of you, Chuck. I saw your name pop up here in the chat, and I was like, oh man, I need to put some music on at the end. So I quickly went over and put a little music on at the end. So when we leave, we'll have something to chill out to while I'm at the end of the show. So that'll be just for the music lovers. This is Turfgrass Epistemology. We're trying to find out how we know what we know about turfgrass science. We do go into great depth in soils and turfgrass. This last month or so, we've been going over diseases. We're going to be going over diseases for the foreseeable future. We've been talking a little bit about urea and iron. So we're looking at how to control diseases without applying a fungicide. So these last couple episodes have been, I think, useful for a lot of people in Canada, a lot of people in Europe, many states that, for whatever reason aren't allowing you to apply fungicides. These are management practices that can help move the needle in your favor. It may not necessarily control all of disease, but it's certainly going to help minimize the reliance upon fungicides, some of these management practices. So we have discussed urea, foliar applied urea, applied once weekly or once every other week at about, I guess it was 0.4 and 0.6 pounds in. And it was the 0.6 pounds of nitrogen from urea every couple of weeks that really showed a beneficial reduction in dollar spot. And then it was the last episode or two, we've talked about the application of iron sulfate and how about 4 pounds of iron per acre to maybe 8 pounds of iron per acre from foliar applied iron sulfate can also have an influence on diseases, on dollar spot specifically. And we also looked into the actual functionality of that as well. And it seems like the evidence is indicating that iron sulfate itself is at least fungistatic, if not completely toxic to the pathogen that causes dollar spot. So we're learning a little bit more about not just that the iron sulfate is masking the disease, it's actually having an activity on the disease. We also learned that urea is not just growing out of the disease. There seems to be potentially at least some influence on the microbe activity in the soil, and that having some sort of activity with the disease as well. Yeah. So yeah, Chuck, just throw the question in the chat. So does it mean that you can eliminate all fungicides? Well, when you don't have any fungicides available to you and you can't apply it, then certainly these are management practices. But even when you do have fungicides available to you, these management practices where we're applying a little bit of foliar urea, we're applying a little bit of iron sulfate with the intent of minimizing dollar spot can also be greatly beneficial. What we haven't really gone into yet is the combination of the two, urea and iron sulfate. Is the combination of these two, they're compounding the benefit. So if you're seeing a benefit from urea and you're seeing a benefit from iron sulfate, maybe combining the two would even be more beneficial than either one independently. And the paper we're going to go over tonight is exactly that. They also include a fungicide in here as well as a non-treated for a positive and a negative control. But we're going to talk about that tonight, okay? Before we get started real quick, tomorrow I'll be driving to Virginia. I'll be in Blacksburg, Virginia at the Pedagogy Conference in Blacksburg on Thursday. I'll be speaking at 3 or 3:15 with my friend Dr. Daryl Pravat on digital communication and how to communicate the topic that you want to talk about, whether it's English or math, and in this case, soil and turfgrass, but do it in such a way that infuses an epistemological framework to it. I think there's a lot of benefit to that, as this channel has shown many, many times over with the emails and the comments I get about all the money you guys are saving and all the management practices and all the practices that you were doing that you've since moved away from, and yet you're still seeing the same exact turfgrass and you're using less product and costing you less money. Those sorts of benefits, I think, are partially due to the soil and turfgrass that we go over, but also to the framework that I try to use to teach that. And so I'll be talking about that at the pedagogy conference on this Thursday. I guess it's February 5th, 2026 in Blacksburg, Virginia. So if anybody's around that area and you want to, come by and check out and see what I'm doing, feel free, or we'll just hang out and have a drink. If you want to have a drink, shoot me an email and we will connect. Okay. All right. Let's get into this episode. I think I reread this paper before getting on the air today, and I think it's much easier than I originally thought it would be when I read it. And in the more recent papers in crop science and in the Tri-Society journals, they're starting to put in a general speech language or general plain language summary. They're requiring that nowadays. So you can't use any SI units. You can't use any scientific speech. It's more for the, average person. And so this paper has that. And although I don't like writing those things when I write a paper and then they come back and say, oh, you got to write this plain language summary. I'm like, ah. So although I don't like doing that necessarily, it's really, really good for people like me when the topic is I'm not particularly well versed in the topic of diseases, and it kind of sums up the entire importance of the paper. And we'll be sure to go over that before the end of the show today. Okay. So let's get into it. So this paper is entitled Optimizing Liquid Applied Iron Sulfate Rate and Application Interval for Dollar Spot Suppression on Golf Course Fairways. Now, they're going to talk about fairways, but this also applies to many homeowners who are keeping their lawns equivalent to fairways or equivalent to tee boxes. You're cutting with reel mowers, you're cutting with rotor mowers, but you're keeping them cut every 5 or 6 days or once a week, whatever the case is. And they look as good or better than many tee boxes and fairways that I've come across. Some of these lawns are immaculate. So don't be turned off when it says golf course fairways, because I've been shocked at how many homeowners I come across now that have lawns that are as good or better than any golf course tee box. It's amazing. So this is right up y'all's alley. So this is a really high expectation lawn situation, as well as golf fairways, as well as potentially sport turf as well if you're dealing with bluegrass. Okay, because I think there's 2 different grasses in this article. This was published in Crop Science just last year, 2 years ago, 2024, in October 2024, by Dr. Soldat, Hockmeyer, McCall, Straw, and Koch. So we're going to be dealing with a couple different locations here. Let's get to it. All right, dollar spot is the most economically important disease of golf course turfgrass worldwide. Cultural practices are only modestly effective at suppressing dollar spot, and golf course superintendents apply more fungicides to suppress dollar spot than any other turfgrass disease. Reliance on fungicides for turfgrass disease suppression has increased in recent years and resulted in financial uncertainty at certain facilities due to rising costs of fungicides. In addition, resistance of the dollar spot pathogen has been documented to numerous fungicide chemical classes and has led to concerns about future fungicide efficacies against dollar spot. Finally, governments in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere have removed numerous effective fungicides from the market due to environmental and human health concerns, increasing the difficulty of managing dollar spot effectively. All these factors have led to increased interest in the use of fungicide alternatives for dollar spot control. The cultural practice most associated with dollar spot suppression is nitrogen fertilization. Numerous studies over several decades have demonstrated that increased rates of nitrogen resulted in decreased dollar spot, though suppression was rarely commercially acceptable. And that's what I mentioned at the beginning. I mean, you're moving the needle in your favor. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to completely eradicate dollar spot just by applying nitrogen, but you're certainly moving the needle well into your favor. And there's no reason to not consider that. I mean, I'm not saying don't apply fungicides if you have the ability to do that. I'm just saying if you're following IPM and you're applying a little bit of nitrogen and then you still have unacceptable turf from dollar spot, then fungicides would be the next logical step. But in the United States, we're real quick to jump to the fungicides. real quick. Just throw it out, throw it out, throw it out, throw it out. Same thing with PGRs. My God, in South Florida, they're putting out PGRs like every 2 or 3 days down there, just pounding it every 2 or 3 days, like 1 ounce, 2 ounces. It's like, wow. So we are, I think, wasteful in many regards in the United States because we have had the luxury of having all these products available to us. Well, you can still have them available to you, but you follow IPM like this nitrogen application or iron sulfate application, and you can reduce the fungicide applications and still have the exact same quality as you would if you just went to the higher rates of fungicides with none of this. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but keep that in mind. You can definitely reduce the risk and reduce your costs and reduce the impact on the environment just by following a little bit of nitrogen and iron sulfate. More recent research using repeated applications of liquid applied urea demonstrated that the response of Dollar Spot to nitrogen was nonlinear with minimal reductions in disease at lower fertilization rates, but dramatic reductions at the, say, 3/4 of a pound of nitrogen every 2-week rate. Okay. Iron, typically applied as iron sulfate, is a fertilizer that is regularly used by turfgrass managers to improve turfgrass color. However, a growing body of literature has documented that liquid applications of iron sulfate at relatively high application rates, being about 8 pounds of iron per acre, can suppress dollar spot. And for those international audience, it's 48 kilograms per hectare of iron sulfate, or 8 pounds of iron per acre. And microdosing patch on golf course turfgrass. These application rates are significantly greater than typical application rates of iron sulfate for color improvement, and such high rates can create challenges with iron solubility, phytotoxicity, and potential for undesirable darkening of turfgrass leaves. And like I've mentioned, around 1 to 5 pounds of iron per acre is what you're going to have to get a color response. When you get down below 1 pound, I'm not convinced that you're going to consistently see the response you're expecting. You can, if you're applying a foliar applied iron sulfate and you're applying it at like a half pound or 1/4 pound, it's possible, but I wouldn't bank on it. You need to get up to about that 1 pound rate, and you can follow the label in some of these, or read the label in some of these liquid products, and do the math and see how much iron you're putting out, if it's just iron, or if it's just whatever's in the liquid, and figure out how much iron you're putting out. And then if you're not seeing the response you're seeing, and it's less than 1 pound iron per acre, just do the math and adjust the rate accordingly. When you get above 5 pounds is where I've historically found the risk is a little greater than most people are willing to tolerate in terms of burn or blackening of the turf. So, and it's going to depend on the time of year, the heat, and the moisture, and all these things. But 1 to 5 pounds is generally pretty safe. So they mentioned that the rate they're talking about is a little higher than what's typically applied. It might be a little bit, 8 pounds of iron per acre, but I've done that many, many, many times and been safe. But I'm sure if you don't know what you're doing, you apply 8 pounds of iron per acre, you could do it the wrong time of year and cause some problems, particularly in hot weather. But nevertheless, that's what they applied, and that's what they've seen in terms of phytotoxicity to some diseases and seeing some color response. Pesticide application practices such as water carrier volume and reapplication interval can have a significant impact on product efficacy. We're going to talk about carrier volume today. For some reason, a lot of people are really interested in carrier volume. And we're going to talk about that today. I can say this before we even go into this article. I'm going to show it in this article. I could show you in another 5 or 10 articles the exact same result. And that is, within reason, carrier volume does not have that much of an impact on the efficacy of products, whether it's a pesticide or whether it's a nutrient. So if you're going to go down to like half a pound per or half a gallon per acre, half a gallon per 1,000. Or you're going to go up to 2 gallons per 1,000. And you're going to say, well, I need to go to 2 to get the response. Or if I go down to half a pound, I'm not going to get a response. There's not a whole lot of meat on that bone. I'll be frank. And you're going to see that in this paper. And I can show you 5 other papers that show the exact same thing within reason. I mean, if you're going to go out at 1/16 of a gallon per 1,000 or whatever, some ridiculous rate that won't even cover the leaf, then that's different. But within reason, that 1 to 2 gallons per 1,000 or, 40 to 80 gallons per acre, or I'm sorry, what am I doing the math right? Yeah, 40 to 80 gallons per acre, or 1 to 2 gallons per 1,000. You're fine one way or the other. So if you don't want to carry around that much water in your spray rig and going out at 80 gallons per acre, and you want to cut it down to 40 gallons per acre, there's a pretty dang good chance you're probably going to get the exact same efficacy, assuming that you're putting out the right amount of AI over that area. And you're going to see that today. So, this is another benefit of this paper, or, a value to this paper is they talk about carrier volume. And they I don't know if they show it in a graph, but they do have carrier volume as a fixed effect in this paper. In general, turfgrass managers prefer to spray in as little water and with the longest reapplication interval possible to maximize labor efficiency. Most research has shown that water volumes between 280 and 1,700 liters per hectare have little effect on fungicide performance against multiple turfgrass diseases. So just so you know, that 280 is, I think it's around a half a gallon per thousand. Someone can do the math and throw it in the chat if I'm wrong. And this 1,600 liters per hectare is around, I think it's around 4 gallons per thousand, I think. Or that would be around 160 gallons per acre. So we're dealing 280 liters per hectare is quite low, and 1,600 is quite high. And in that range, there's Butler 2019 and McDonald 2006, and there's other papers as well that have shown that within those ranges, assuming that you put out the same amount of AI, the efficacy of fungicides is essentially not affected by it. Okay. Good evening, Miles. The same limited impact of water volume has been documented with iron sulfate against microdocium patch by Maddox in 2020 and Dollar Spot by Hutchins in 2020. So I'm not here to say that carrier volume is completely meaningless. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that within reason, half a gallon per thousand up to 2 or 3 gallons per thousand, that'd be on the high end. There's not much difference. Now, when you're talking in science, in research, I don't know how everybody does their business. Everybody has their own logistical restraints. But in research, we are putting that out to the freaking decimal point accurate. We're using specialized spray rigs with specialized pressure tanks that have pressure on the tank, pressure on the handle, pressure on the boom. Every head is exactly where it should be. We know exactly, as close as we possibly can get, the volume that's going out over that given area. The reason I'm saying that is, if you're not that accurate, or you have give in your tank, or you have one spray rig to the next spray rig, there's a lot of variation in it, and you think you're going out at a half a gallon per thousand, and indeed you're going out at a tenth of a gallon per thousand or something, then obviously that wouldn't qualify, and that wouldn't be relevant. So I'm just saying, if you got it dialed in tight and you know that rate is what it is, the volume's going out is what the volume is. If you're between about a half a gallon per thousand to about 2 or 3 gallons per thousand, then it's a wash. It's basically, you're going to see the same effect one way or the other. Okay. I know there's a lot of spray specialists out there who would, can definitely argue that point. But I'm just saying, from the literature I've read and from the research that I've done, you just don't see a whole lot of difference between these. Okay. As long as you're getting it out on the square footage you're supposed to get it out on, you got the right AI out there and the, so forth, the pounds on the ground, the difference is negligible. Regarding the optimal iron sulfate reapplication interval for dollar spot suppression, most studies have used a 14-day reapplication interval in their work when iron sulfate was applied at 8 pounds per acre of iron, or 48 kilograms a hectare of iron sulfate. The objectives of this research were to determine the optimum rate, application interval, and water carrier volume for iron sulfate efficiency or efficacy against dollar spot, and to investigate the integration of iron sulfate into dollar spot disease control programs with varying rates of fungicides, nitrogen, and application frequency on creeping bentgrass and annual bluegrass. Oh, this is annual bluegrass, not Kentucky bluegrass. So that's a good objective, but there's no hypothesis from this. I really wish my peers and scholarly authors would write the objective fine, but no problem. That's a perfectly good objective. Just then write a hypothesis. That way I can formulate a null hypothesis, and you can formulate a null hypothesis. And then you can fail to reject it or reject a null hypothesis. This is the way it's conducted in science. But I guess I'll just keep preaching the message, and hopefully sometime it gets through. I don't know. But I'm guilty of it too. I mean, I've certainly had papers out there that just say the objective. I didn't actually formulate a good hypothesis in my younger years, but I've corrected that, and so I'm offering that as a means to the authors to write stronger papers. I think they'd write stronger papers if they would take that into consideration. All right, the materials and methods. You are going to see a treatment list on this that rivals any treatment list of any study I've ever seen. This is one of the most robust studies in terms of magnitude and precision that I've ever seen, like bar none. It's shock. I don't know. In fact, let me look. How did this get funded? This had to have been funded somewhere. Oh, so funding, here it is. Funding for portions of this work were provided by the GCSAA, okay, the Wisconsin chapter. So it was funded by the golf associations. I was going to say, you can't just pull that together. That's a lot. I'll show the depth of this study is impressive. And you can't, with some things we can kind of swing, we can just kind of throw some scraps together and try to figure out how to make it work. But you can't do something like that with the size of this study. Materials and methods. The separate iron sulfate optimization and integration studies were conducted concurrently and replicated in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Virginia in 2018 and 19. So it's 3 different locations for 2 years. So we're dealing with 6 site years. In Wisconsin, the study was conducted at the O.J. Noir Turfgrass Research Education Facility in Madison on a mixed stand of pin-cross creeping bentgrass and annual bluegrass, grown on a silt loam soil. The plots were maintained under fairway conditions. In Minnesota, the studies were conducted at the Minnesota Valley Country Club in Bloomington on a mixed stand of pin-cross creeping bentgrass and annual bluegrass growing on a silt loam soil. The plots were maintained under fairway conditions in Minnesota. In Virginia, all studies were conducted at the Turfgrass Research Center in Blacksburg, which is where I'll be tomorrow. I'm driving to Blacksburg from Lexington tomorrow, on a mixed stand of pin A4 creeping bentgrass and annual bluegrass maintained on a loamy sand soil maintained under tee-height conditions. So we're dealing with 2 fairways and 1 tee-height, and essentially they're all creeping bentgrass with annual bluegrass mixed in. Okay? Now, treatments for the optimization and integration studies are listed in Table 1. Now, before I show Table 1, you need to let me read this, and then I'll explain how impressed I am by this magnitude of this study. Let me read the materials methods that kind of get you an idea. Iron sulfate was applied as extreme green and contains 20% iron and ferrous sulfate heptahydrate. The fungicide treatments in the integration study was changed from boscalid in 2018 to fluoxypyroxad in 2019 due to suspected fungicide resistance to boscalid reported across all locations. Treatments in the integrated study were applied in 612 liters of water, which is roughly 1.5 gallons per thousand, something like that. 60 gallons per acre, something around that number. The number of dollar spot foci per plot turfgrass visual quality turfgrass visual quality were visually assessed every 2 weeks, area under the disease progress curve and area under the turfgrass quality curve, and standardized area under the disease progress curve and standardized area under the turf quality progress curve were calculated by dividing these two together by the length of the dollar spot epidemic. That's interesting. I've never actually seen the turfgrass quality curve except for in one of the studies that I published. So it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure it was around before I did it. I just never came across it. So they're doing the same thing that I did on nitrogen response studies. Okay, so let me show the treatments. I don't know how they did this. The plot sizes were 3 meters. All individual plot sizes for both studies were essentially 1 meter by 3 meter. Where's my calculator? So each one of them was 3 square meters. Okay. And they did, how many replications? 4 replications. Okay. Okay. So look at the treatments, guys. The iron sulfate optimization study had 19 treatments. Okay. And the iron sulfate integration study had 15. So if you have a 3 square meter plot and you have 4 reps and you have 19 treatments, that's 230 square meters at each location for just that one study. And the other one's essentially 200 square meters. It's nuts. That's a big, big study. 19 treatments. So you have 19 times 4. You have 76 plots out there that you got to rate every 2 weeks or whatever. You got to do these readings on. That is an enormous amount of work. So good on the GCSAA for funding this stuff and the Golf Course Associations for funding this. That is a massive, massive amount of labor to do that. Grad students galore, staff galore. Okay, I'm telling you. That is a lot of work. So good on you guys, the authors and the funders of this work, because wow, I am thoroughly impressed. I mean, we do in-depth studies that are bigger than that, and we do seed trial studies that are bigger than that, but those are kind of easy. It's just you put them out, you do a little rating once a month, and you go out there and you do a little dry down or whatever. Those are not that particularly complicated. But on this, they're doing treatments. Look at all these treatments. You have to do all these treatments individually. Some of them are on 7-day intervals. Some of them are on 14-day intervals. Some of them have 3 or 4 different rates of 3 different rates of nitrogen or iron sulfate. You got different volumes of water, 300, 612, 1223 liters per hectare of volume of water. I mean, that's a lot of work. That is a crazy amount of work. And that's just the optimization project. The iron sulfate integration study had urea, then it had urea every 7 days, urea every 14 days. They had urea plus a fungicide. They had urea plus a fungicide every 14 or 28 days. I mean, iron sulfate every 7 days, iron sulfate every 14 days, iron sulfate with fungicides. They had, the fungicide was applied every 28 days or 42 days. And then they had, it's just, look at all this. It's a factorial. It's a 4x4x3 factorial, essentially is what it is. Massive, massive amount of labor. So I wish people would recognize. Like if you went out with me one day and if we were going to rate these plots, have the members go out with me and just watch, or whoever, all of us go out and watch the raters rate these plots. Just do it once. And you would see hours to do this, okay? And you got to do that every 2 weeks or every week, however, what the interval is. Then you got to apply these treatments, some of them every 7 days, once a week. And then the other ones every week you're applying like half the treatments. And then the other week you're applying all the treatments. And the next week's a half of treatments. That's a lot of work. But you can see all the combinations. Basically what we're going to find out is you're going to look at iron sulfate every 7 days, and you're going to be able to compare that to urea every 7 days. Or iron sulfate every 14 days compared to urea every 7 days, or compared to urea every 14 days. So now we're going to be able to tell, because it's a factorial, well, is urea having the effect, or is iron sulfate having a better effect? Is combining them having a better effect than either one individually? You see how that's set up like that? A lot of answers you can get from a study like this. So I'm not going to go into all these treatments, but you can pause it here, but it's a lot. They applied iron sulfate at 0 kilograms per hectare, 9 kilograms, 18 kilograms, 36 kilograms per hectare. They did it every 7 days or every 14 days. They did it in 3 different water volumes. It's a lot, okay? Okay, now let's get into the results. They basically, and this is what happens when you have a study this big. It's very difficult to avoid this. There's almost no way you're going to avoid this. It says all main effects, treatment, location, and year, and interactions were significant for dollar spot severity, so the results are presented within each site year. So in other words, they got interactions all over creation. So they're going to look at the results within each site year. So within each location, within each year, basically is what they're saying. Okay. So what I did here I highlighted a lot of stuff in the results, but I'll probably just show them in these tables and graphs because they do a good job of explaining it or showing it. So we're going to look at Minnesota in 2018 and 2019 first. Okay. And we're going to look at the iron sulfate rate. We're looking at the impact of iron sulfate application rate on dollar spot severity and turfgrass quality, okay, using the area under degrees progress curve and the area under the turfgrass quality curve. And we see the zero rate has, in the Minnesota in 2018 for the disease, has 114. And then when you apply iron sulfate, what you would want to see is the next application rate of iron sulfate being 9 kilograms per hectare, and that would be, what would that be? 9. What would that be? Times. So it's like 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. So it'd be 1.5. Let me just write this here because I'm going to forget. 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, 3, and then 6, I guess. 6 pounds of iron per acre from iron sulfate. So what you'd like to see is as soon as you apply a little iron, you want to see this number go down. And it went from 114, and indeed it did go down to 72 statistically. It went down to 72. And then when you apply more, it went to 63, but it's the same. But then when you apply the highest rate at 6 pounds of iron per acre, you see a reduction to 46 from 114. So you see an increase in the control of dollar spot the more iron you applied in Minnesota in 2018. However, also what you'd like to see is you'd like to see the quality either stay the same or go up. And unfortunately, in Minnesota in 2018, you saw the quality go down. Okay. Went from 6 to 5.25 down to almost 5. Okay. So you saw that go down, unfortunately. That's the only location you really saw that on, I think. Yes. That's the only time you saw that go down. Now we go to Minnesota in 2018 or 2019. You saw the reduction occur again when you applied 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, went from 222 under the disease progress curve down to 140. And you applied a little bit more at 3 pounds per acre and went down to 120. You applied more up to 6 pounds of iron per acre and went down to 90. So you see a consistent reduction in the disease the more iron you applied in Minnesota in 2019. However, in 2019, you did see an increase in the quality as well. And that's what you'd want to see. It went from 5.1 to 5.6 up to 5.7. So you saw about a 0.5 point increase in quality under the turfgrass quality curve in 2019. So it is controlling the disease at the 1.5 pounds of iron. It's also controlling it at 3 and 6. And then in the last year, it increased the quality. In the first year, it decreased the quality. When you go to Virginia in 2018 and in 2019, you see more or less what we would expect, and that is we didn't see a response from the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. And in 2018, we didn't see a reduction in the disease, but we did at the 3 pounds of iron per acre and the 6 pounds of iron per acre. But we didn't see any increase or decrease in quality, which is fine. In 2019, you saw a reduction in the disease at the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, went from 37 to 28, and then it stayed down to 24 and down to 21. You applied 3 and 6 pounds of iron per acre. So you saw again the benefit of applying iron sulfate, and the minimum rate essentially is 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. You might apply a little bit more. You might see a little bit of a benefit, but you're not seeing a whole lot more benefit beyond that 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. And the quality in Virginia went up from 6.5 to 7.25, basically, at the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. And it went up to 7.3 and 7.3. So not much of there was no increase above the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre in Virginia in 2019. And then essentially, give or take, in Wisconsin, you saw the exact same thing you saw in Virginia, and that is a reduction in the disease starting at the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, an increase in the quality starting at 1.5 pounds of iron per acre in 2018 and in 2019. Okay. So the magic number for control of dollar spot under these conditions was 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, with increased levels of iron being the 3 and the 6 pounds, showing potentially a little bit of additional control, but not really much bang for that buck. You saw a point of diminishing returns, essentially. Okay, you might get a little bit more, but the real money savings, the real return on the investment came at the 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. And you saw an increase in quality starting at that 1.5 pounds of iron per acre in every site year except for the Minnesota year in 2018. And then you applied a little bit more iron or a little bit more iron, 3 and 6 pounds. You didn't see a whole lot of increase at all. I don't think you saw any increase at all. Very little, if any, increase at all above that 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. So to me, if you guys are superintendents or sport people or home lawn care people, whatever the case is, and you want to know, well, where should I start? I would start at 1.5 pounds of iron per acre. And then we're going to talk about the application intervals, okay? But that's where you'd want to go in terms of the application rate. That seems to be the best money spent. And it's not necessarily, well, I applied 1.5, it's good, so 3 must be better. Well, look at this chart. It's rare that it was better. There's 1 or 2 little blips on a radar, but most of the time, the benefit that you're going to get from iron sulfate was achieved at 1.5 pounds, and applying more wasn't particularly advantageous. Okay? Now, we're going to go to, I'm just going to read this. Now, I'm going to read this because they don't show the data. It says, water volume did not impact sulfate suppression of Dollar Spot, iron sulfate suppression of Dollar Spot in any site year, not a 95% confidence level. The data are not shown here. So they didn't show the data. What they're saying is, we didn't show the data because they didn't have any effect. Whether you applying it at, what were the application volumes? 300, 600, or 1,200 liters per hectare, which would be whatever, around 30 gallons per acre, 60 gallons per acre, 120 gallons per acre. Some rough numbers I'm throwing out there, okay? Didn't have any effect, okay? And that's very consistent in the literature. It did not influence the efficacy of iron sulfate and its activity on Dollar Spot, okay? When we look at the charts here, we're looking at Dollar Spot severity on the y-axis and rate on the x-axis, and you can see how increasing the rate, this is the linear regression of iron sulfate application rate versus Dollar Spot severity, okay? And you can see that you do see a reduction in Dollar Spot severity in Minnesota, the higher the rate went. I know I just mentioned that the 1.5 pounds is really kind of where the sweet spot is of iron per acre. They do show a regression here that does show a reduction as you get higher. They show a little bit of reduction in Virginia and then a little bit in Wisconsin as well, where the lines, it's a negative slope. So you're seeing a reduction as you get higher in the rates. But the previous table is really showing you can get a little bit more, as like I mentioned, but the real benefit is from that first 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, okay? Now, let's look at the impact of iron sulfate application frequency on Dollar Spot severity. Okay, now we're going to look at, okay, how frequently should we be applying it? They did it at 0, and then they did it once a week, and they did it once every 2 weeks. And you'll notice in Minnesota in 2018, in 2019, in every year, Virginia, 1819, Wisconsin, 1819, you will see that the 7-day application interval results in the lowest Dollar Spot severity in every year except in Wisconsin 2019 when it was equivalent to 14. In other words, there was no application interval that was better than the 7-day application interval. 7 days was always better than the 14-day except in one site year when it was equivalent to 14 days. So if you want to play the odds and you want to try to move the needle in your favor, I'd be applying 1.5 pounds of iron per acre about every 7 days, which is what I've been saying for 20 years. Okay. I'm just saying that. I'm just speaking from a nutritionist perspective. People will say, well, how often should I apply it? My answer is, how fast is your grass growing? Because if you're mowing it once a week, you're probably going to need to apply it about once a week. If you're like me and you don't really care, and you're growing St. Augustine grass and you're like, whatever, it doesn't matter to me. I'm in Florida and, I'm going to mow it every 2 weeks. Then it's probably going to last about 2 weeks. But if you're mowing it, every 4 or 5 days, it's probably going to last 4 or 5 days. In other words, that stain, the effect of iron sulfate on the leaf tissue is really just superficial makeup is all it is. And as soon as the grass grows up and it gets cut off that had the makeup on it, the next tissue coming up no longer has it on it, and it's not going to be protected by it or colored by it. So this is really good evidence to show that about once a week. If you really want to have a high maintenance turf grass, a high quality turf grass, and you want the iron sulfate to be as efficacious as possible, you're going to want to apply it once a week. Iron sulfate once a week at about 1.5 pounds. Now, I personally probably wouldn't do the 1.5 pounds. I mean, I probably wouldn't do that. I would probably just go to 1 pound. It's just easy math and round numbers. And it's you're doing that 1.5 pounds a week every single week during the growing season. That can add up. There's a lot of iron out there. And you're going to end up, some seasons are going to be warmer. Some season, time of the year is going to be cooler. And you're going to see some fluctuation in that. In other words, what I'm saying is the risk of burn is very low between 1 and 5, but it's not zero. Okay. It ain't zero. And it's definitely not zero when you're doing it every 7 days. So I would just be very, very careful and cautious and know that this is where I would start. And then it would be up to your site-specific calibration, the art of your turf management at your location, to dial it up or down based upon your site-specific conditions. Okay. All right. Now let's look at this graph. These are I think these are RStudio graphs or something. I should have done R or like SPSS in grad school. Instead, I did SAS, and now the only language I speak is SAS. These software programs print out these nice little pretty graphs, and I wish I could do that. Anyway, so we're looking at dollar spot severity on the y-axis and date on the x-axis, and we're looking at iron sulfate every 14 days, every 7 days, or the non-treated. And what you'll notice in this particular graph, what I want to point out, is that when you apply the product, you will see, let's say on the materials and methods, they actually have the dates they applied them. Let's say they applied the product right here on June 20th or around June 20th. You're going to see a reduction in the disease, a very sharp reduction. But it doesn't take long for the dollar spot severity to spike right back up. Okay, we're talking from June 6th to July 3rd, a month, 4 weeks, and it tripled. The dollar spot severity tripled in 4 weeks. So you can imagine if you're on 14-day intervals and you go, whoops, it's been raining for 3 days and I can't go out and apply it. Now you're on, instead of 14 days, you're at 20 days. That dollar spot's going to go through the roof. But if you're on 7-day intervals, which is what this green line is, well, this dollar spot was going up. Well, 7-day interval, they hit it right here. You can see where they hit it, and then the dollar spot severity went down. But they didn't hit the next one for another 14 days. And the disease was rampant at that point. So this shows the peaks and valleys of dollar spot severity can be minimized following the 7-day application interval, which is all common sense. I know a lot of times we like to think that, but common sense isn't that common. Especially, that's an assumption that we make. The question we ask on this channel is, how do you know? How do you know it's common sense? How do you know? Well, here's how we know. This is data to support that management practice of 7-day applications of iron sulfate rather than 14-day applications. Because if you do happen to get it at a point where the disease is going to skyrocket, you're more likely to have a little bit of activity or control from the iron sulfate as opposed to missing it. Okay. So now we're talking 1.5 pounds of iron sulfate about every 7 days, and the carrier volume can be anywhere from 0.5 gallon to 2 gallons per 1,000. So we're really starting to dial it in here. The only question is, well, is there any benefit to applying urea or adding something to it? Okay, let's look and see what we find on those integration data. Okay. The treatments, let's see, did I go to table 5 yet? No, I didn't. Let me just read this part here and I'll just read this red part here. The addition of urea to iron sulfate applied every 7 days did not impact dollar spot development in any site year. Dollar spot development was not impacted when the combination was applied every 14 days, except when the addition of urea to iron sulfate increased dollar spot in Virginia in 2019. The programs incorporating iron sulfate, urea, and fungicides generally did not improve dollar spot suppression compared to fungicide applications alone, except where the addition of iron sulfate and urea improved dollar spot and the suppression relative to fungicide alone in Wisconsin in 2019. So in other words, they're saying that fungicide still was the king. Okay, but iron sulfate and urea definitely reduced it. And what I wanted to point out here that I highlighted in table 4 here, is we're looking at the iron sulfate, water volume, and reapplication intervals impact on duration of acceptable turfgrass quality. We're looking at the number of days that turfgrass was acceptable, and we're looking at the rate from non-treated of iron sulfate to, let's see, is this? Yeah, 9, 18, and 36 kilograms per hectare. And then we're looking at acceptable turfgrass quality, the number of days, and you can see the lowest rate, which was what, 1.5 pounds of iron. Is that what it was? What did I write down up here? Yeah, 1.5 pounds of iron per thousand, or per acre, sorry, 1.5 pounds of iron per acre, resulted in 63 quality days days were acceptable quality, and then adding more and more and more didn't increase the quality. It didn't increase the number of days the turf was acceptable. The water volume, here you go. Water volume, 300, 600, and 1,200 liters per hectare, or 30, 60, and 1,200 gallons per acre. And you'll see the number of days turfgrass was acceptable. It did go up from the non-treated, but once the 300 liters per hectare was on, it didn't matter if you added the more and more water volume. It didn't matter. It went from 65 to 65 to 65. It didn't change the number of days that turf was acceptable. And the reapplication interval, 7 and 14, it was 66 and 64, the number of days. So in other words, there's no difference between 7 and 14 in this particular 7 to 14 day application interval on the number of days the turf was acceptable. So these are good data. I mean, these are good, pragmatic, data sets. You can take away from something from this. You can go back to your home or go back to your golf course or your, sport complex or even sod farm or whatever and go, well, it's pretty good evidence to indicate, I should be applying 1.5 pounds of iron per acre about once a week. And the water volume's, half pound or half gallon to 2 gallons per acre, per 1,000 square feet. Any of that's fine. So let's just go out at 1 gallon per 1,000 and move on. And then if you find that you're not finding enough sufficient control, then you can fidget with those dials a little bit because you might have site-specific limitations. Your spray rig might not be as accurate. It might have leak or it might not cover the area necessary. Who knows what it is? You could have too much wind or it's too hot. There's all these variables that we can't account for all the time. And they can definitely alter the results. But you can at least know where to start from. Now, in this next table, we have the impact of iron sulfate combinations with urea and bosclid fungicides on dollar spot severity in the area under the disease progress curve. And I just highlighted 1 or 2 here, and you can see that the iron sulfate applied every 7 days I highlighted, along with iron sulfate applied every 7 days, plus urea applied every 7 days. Okay, and you can look through here all the different site years, and you can see that this. Just iron sulfate alone had a C and a D, and it was 28. And then iron sulfate plus urea has a C and a D, and it's 28 in Minnesota in 2018. In Minnesota in 2019, it has a C, and then in iron sulfate has a C, and iron sulfate with urea has a C. You can go right through here and see that urea every 7 days, iron sulfate every 7 days, compared to iron sulfate every 7 days with urea in it, never resulted in a benefit. There was no benefit in terms of the disease control. So, it's a little bit contrary to the other papers where iron sulfate was having an effect, but urea was having an effect too from another paper we read. But combining them here doesn't seem to be much benefit. Whatever control existed, you're going to get it just from iron sulfate at 7 days. So now if you compare iron sulfate every 7 days with just urea every 7 days, which is up here, you will indeed see some differences where urea here in Minnesota in 2018 was a B at 72, had more disease than iron sulfate did applied at every 7 days, which was 28. Minnesota in 2019 had 84 with disease, and in the same year, iron sulfate every 7 days only had 35. So you can see that indeed in some years, and actually majority of the time, iron sulfate applied every 7 days is having an effect, whereas urea every 7 days rarely does. Now, compared to the non-treated, urea is showing an effect. There's one here in Wisconsin in 2019. There's one here in Minnesota in 2018. There was an effect here and there from urea compared to nothing. But when you're comparing urea, basically apples to apples, urea every 7 days compared to iron sulfate every 7 days, iron sulfate's the champ. And I think that's because iron sulfate is having a direct influence on the pathogen. and urea is not. Or direct beneficial impact on the pathogen, and urea is not. Okay? But please feel free to go through this table. Just pause it and read through it, and you can see all the combinations you want to see. But we're going to wrap it up at the end here real short and to summarize this whole thing pretty quick. Okay? So here it is. Yeah, here they sum this whole thing up, and it says the data and observations in this study support using iron sulfate rates at 1.5 or 3 pounds of iron per acre, or 9 or 18 kilograms per hectare of iron sulfate, if minimizing the risk of phytotoxicity is important. So yes, you can apply these higher rates, but the phytotoxic risk is quite high, and that's what this paragraph talks about right here. Okay. And I'm going to read this last thing, and I'm going to go back and read the summary. Iron sulfate applied alone did not provide complete control of dollar spot in any of the site years of either study and our research, meaning integration of iron sulfate with other chemical and cultural practices is important to provide commercially acceptable dollar spot suppression. So it didn't eradicate it, but it lowered it greatly. Our iron sulfate integration study explored multiple integrated strategies and found that combining iron sulfate with increased nitrogen fertility provided no added suppression relative to either factor on its own. However, integrating iron sulfate with lower fungicide use rates and longer reapplication intervals did provide increased suppression in Wisconsin in 2018. So that's why I didn't go over that, but the inclusion of a fungicide, the lowering the fungicide rate down, along with the iron sulfate, was beneficial in one site year, Wisconsin, 2018. In particular, combining applications of iron sulfate and urea with a fungicide at a 42-day reapplication interval provided the same level of suppression as iron sulfate urea combinations with a fungicide at a 20-day reapplication interval. This extended interval would benefit golf course superintendents by requiring fewer fungicide applications, and may also extend the useful life of current fungicides by reducing their exposure to resistant fungal populations. Okay. So that's pretty much the summation of it. Iron sulfate was beneficial. Fungicides are beneficial. Urea helped a little bit here and there, but the real magnitude of the benefit came from, well, eradication essentially came from fungicides, but you greatly reduce the disease using iron sulfate. And you could reduce the application of fungicides if you had iron sulfate in the blend. Let me go to this. Before I read the questions, let me go to the summarization, because I know I'm going to forget it. I've closed off so many shows where earlier in the show I say, oh, I'm going to go over this, and then I forget about it at the end of the show. So let me do this and then I'll answer the questions. Okay, the plain language summary. Dollar spot is a severe disease affecting amenity turf grasses, and fungicide alternatives are needed to lower costs and manage fungicide-resistant fungi. Past research has shown that iron sulfate can suppress dollar spot development, but little is known about the most effective iron sulfate rate, reapplication interval, and water volume for dollar spot control. Our study was conducted in 2018, 2019 in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Virginia. Iron sulfate suppressed dollar spot in a dose-dependent manner, and reapplication every 7 days were more effective than reapplication every 14 days. No consistent impact of water volume on disease control was observed at any location. In addition, combining iron sulfate with other products like urea fertilizer did not improve disease control compared to iron sulfate applied alone. The results from this study provide important information for golf course superintendents looking to implement iron sulfate usage at their golf course. So that's a pretty good plain language summary. Okay. Now let's go to the question, if there are any questions. Carper Bomber says 6 years. That's admirable time interval. Yeah, that's crazy amount of time. Crazy amount of time. Lots and lots of people working on that. It's very impressive. Yeah, okay. R and sad. Okay. Chuck says, in the last table, DC was rated, but what about turf quality in the last table? Iron sulfate, with all the different combinations. I don't know if turf quality was rated. That's the integration study, Chuck. This is the integration study. I don't recall if they did all of that in this particular one. I don't see it. I might be missing it, but let me see if... Yeah, I don't see it, Chuck. Yeah, I'm probably missing it. If it's probably in here, but I'm probably just missing it. But it's certainly not in the table. It's just the iron sulfate, the standard under the disease progress curve, the influence of these treatments on the disease progress curve. It's not in the table. So if it is somewhere else, then I'm probably looking over it. All right. Sorry about that. All right, guys. So I will hopefully not get snowed in. I think it's snowing outside right now. And tomorrow I'll be on the road. I'll be in Blacksburg, Virginia tomorrow night. And next week, we're going to be going over a paper that talks about irrigation intervals, light and frequent versus deep and infrequent applications of water on disease. I can't remember which disease it is. I don't know if it's dollar spot or gray leaf spot. I can't remember. But we're going over that next Monday on the members only stream. And then I think Tuesday night I'm going to have to put in a comment show because the pages are piling up on the comment show. Last question is, when you state iron and sulfate at 20% total or percent, well, iron sulfate is 19 or 20% iron. It's normally just go by 20% iron in iron sulfate. I don't know if that answers your question, Miles, but so when they say 48 kilograms per hectare of iron sulfate, you got to convert that to pounds per acre and then multiply it by 0.2, which would be the percent of iron in iron sulfate. So there's very, very possible that some of my math is off because I'm not sitting here with a cheat sheet on the side of my computer. I'm doing this in my head. And, but I'm pretty sure that the 1.5, the 3, and the 6 pounds of iron per acre are correct. I did that with my calculator real quick, but I hate doing math on the air because I make mistakes. So, but yeah, iron sulfate is 20% iron in most cases. Yeah. All right, guys, here's some music. I'll see you guys next Monday. Have a good one. Bye.